Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Code and the Code Encoders Who Code It. I'm your host, Drew Bragg, and joined with me today is Joel Drapper. Joel, would you like to introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Hello, I'm a software engineer who is currently working pretty much full-time on open source, taking a break between jobs. So I have been working on Phlex most recently, which is a kind of different take on view component, kind of challenging what we think about how we build web application views in Ruby. Essentially, I'm trying to see if there's a good way to do it entirely in Ruby, entirely with object-oriented programming, and avoiding writing any HTML or ERB. So that's kind of what I've been working on lately.
So for those of you who are new to the show, I'm going to ask Joel 3 questions. I'm going to ask him what he's working on, if he has any blockers, and if he doesn't have a blocker, what's one that he recently had and how did he go about solving it? Then I'm going to ask him to share something cool or new or interesting that he's recently learned or discovered. So let's just jump right into it because I am a big fan of Phlex and I want to hear about all the things that you're doing with it. So Joel, what are you working on?
Lately, I've been working on a particular feature of Phlex, which is basically trying to figure out streaming with Phlex. And this, I feel, is a bit of a lost art. Recently, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of streaming HTML pages to people. We have things like turbo streams, they're called, but turbo streams isn't really streaming. It's still sending the entire request out to the client before the client renders it. It's not like sending parts of a request in chunks and then having the client be able to render it as it goes. So streaming basically is a way of saying, when you load a web application, instead of your browser having to download the entire page before it can start rendering it, and instead of the server having to render an entire page before it can send it to the client, the server can send small chunks of that page as it goes. So it has some advantages and some disadvantages. For example, if you were to try to send a chunk that was like the size of a single character, for example, that would be not good for performance. That would be way worse for performance. You're sending like thousands of chunks. And there's obviously some kind of overhead to taking a chunk and sending that to the client. But on the other side, I think there's like a balance between doing the entire page in one go and sending like tiny chunks, which is sending the perfectly optimized chunk size. And that's really, really difficult to calculate. I don't know if there is a correct answer. Mm-hmm. And so in Phlex, what we're trying to do is kind of just have a good default, which will be, let's stream the head tag, like the entire head tag as soon as we have it. So the initial version is like, we start rendering the page. As soon as we get to the end of the head tag, we stream that to the client. The client can receive it and start doing things like, for the client being your browser, so like Safari or Chrome or something, can start downloading external assets like linked style sheets, your JavaScript files, fonts, that kind of thing, everything that's linked in the head tag. And then while that's all happening, the server is rendering the body of the page. Eventually, it can send the rest of the body back to the client. The other thing that I'm trying to work on is basically a way of saying, okay, now we've sent the head and we start building the body. If we reach a point where rendering the page is actually blocked by I/O, so it's blocked by, say, a database call or an external network request from the server, then we use the time while we're waiting for that request or that query to be loaded from the database to send another chunk. So essentially in your Rails controller, you might say, here's my database query. I want you to execute this asynchronously. You can just, in Active Record, you can add load async to the end of your query. And basically, Active Record will start executing that in the background. You can then start rendering your page while that's all happening in the background. And the idea is as soon as your page starts waiting on that query before it can continue rendering, it will say, well, I've already built up like so far. I'm going to take what I've got so far and like send it to the client immediately so that they don't have to wait. They might get like the header and the layout, maybe the nav bar, etc., but they don't actually get the content that was waiting on that database query. And then eventually, as soon as the database query is ready, can continue rendering the rest of the page and stream that. We're talking like milliseconds usually of difference, but just trying to make apps feel snappier, basically, by using streaming.
Right. That makes sense. Why do you think that's not a common thing now? Because I mean, the way that you just described it makes me go, I want that and I want it now. Because yeah, that's almost always the bottleneck is we have one really long running query and Then we're waiting for that to finish, and then we're waiting to render and then send it over. Everything you just said sounds awesome. So why isn't that a thing already?
Yeah, I don't know. There is a way to do this in Rails. I don't know how stable it is because I've never heard of anyone using it, and the API docs look quite old. There's kind of a way to do this, but not with the thing where it will cut a chunk every time you're waiting on IO. So yeah, I don't know why it's not more popular. It is quite tricky. I've been having problems with browser compatibility with certain things. Not in a terrible way, but just in a way where some browsers don't seem to be getting the best performance that they could be getting. The worst case is that they take just as long as they ever would have done without streaming, essentially. But the best case, like in Chrome seems to do a very good job of reading streams and it starts rendering immediately. So I'm not entirely sure why it's not a more popular technique. It does have some drawbacks. For example, you send a 200 response pretty much immediately, and then you start actually sending the real response. So if you encounter an error, what do you do? That's one of the drawbacks. And for me, I think that that's not a big deal. What we do is we will say, if we encounter an error while we're rendering a page, we will rescue the error and we then stream a closing quotation mark and then a closing greater than symbol to make sure that we close any tag that we might be halfway through, like HTML tag. And then we'll start a new script tag that just says window.location equals /500.html. So you get redirected to the error page if we encounter an error. And that's done via JavaScript. Because remember, we've already said to your browser, yep, this is good, 200 response, everything's great. And we've started maybe sending some content already and they started rendering it. And then suddenly there's an error. So the best thing we can do at that point is send a redirect via JavaScript. And actually, we also have to make sure if you're using content security policies that this piece of JavaScript is signed. So there's a way in Rails that you can sign inline JavaScript with a nonce. So we're using that helper to generate the JavaScript. But yeah, I don't know why it's not more popular. I feel like it kind of died with server-side rendering in a sense. I don't know. I really don't understand why it's not more popular because it's brilliant. At the end of the day, it improves noticeable performance. And I guess there is a real performance improvement in the sense that your browser can start prefetching assets more quickly. But a lot of it is just perceived performance. It feels faster, even though it's not actually faster. You don't get the entire page any faster, but you get some bits of the page and you can start visually grabbing things and getting a feel for the layout and seeing the branding and things like that. That can happen really early on. The other technique that we're exploring is having the page. So you can say this section of the page is slow and you can just wrap it in this special component that says, I can't remember the name of the component, but basically it's like a delayed component, right? Or asynchronous component or something like that. Asynchronous isn't quite the right word. But you're saying this part is too slow. So we don't want to block the page from rendering because it's got to render this part of the page. Instead, what Phlex will do is it will output a div with a unique ID in that area where that block was meant to be. And then it stores the block and waits until the end of your HTML document. So you can continue rendering the page. It's output a div that's got a placeholder. That could be a loading message or a spinner or something like that. And then when it gets to the end of the document, the last HTML tags that it puts on the end of the document are turbo stream tags. And they're just turbo streams at the end of the document that say, replace this ID with this content. And so it doesn't matter that that content takes a while to load. You've already loaded everything around it, not only before it, but also after it. And then you can then fill in using turbo the real content where you've got the spinners or the loading messages.
That is a very cool technique. I like that. How did that idea come about? And I asked the question, how did that idea come about? Because as you say it, it's oh yeah, that's brilliant. And of course you would do it that way. And that's how you would abuse streams to fill in content. But I feel like everything is so magical and mysterious until someone says, oh yeah, I just had this idea and this is how we do it. And it's why haven't we been doing this forever? Yeah. So how did that idea come up of oh, we can just take chunks that we know are going to take a long time to render them off in the side, render the rest of the page, and then use turbo streams to kind of hot swap in?
I can't quite remember where it came from, actually, but it was just this idea of Turbo Streams already does this. Turbo Streams is such a simple concept. It's just a custom HTML element that has an action and then some content, or like even some attributes, right? Like any HTML element can have attributes and content, and one of those actions just happens to be an action. And then there's some code on the page that knows to listen for these elements being created and then do things when they're created, as opposed to just display things. So when you do like a turbo stream replace, what the server is sending back is just an HTML tag that's like literally the tag turbo stream with the action replace and then the content. And that means that you can just deliver that action wherever you want. You don't have to have it be the response to a request from the page. Like when you submit a form or something, you can respond with turbo stream action. But actually, you can just put a turbo stream action at the bottom of the page, right? And it can affect something at the top of the page. I feel like this just wouldn't have made much difference if it wasn't for the fact that if the page is already streamed via like HTTP streaming of the HTML, then it wouldn't make any difference, right? Whether you were rendering at the end of the page or at the top of the page, it wouldn't make any difference because you're going to have to wait for the whole document to finish loading before you can see anything anyway. But because we're able to send the document in chunks, whenever we're like waiting on something, we can just flush the buffer to the browser. It means that we can essentially give you the entire page just with placeholders, and then you can wait on these last couple of elements to be rendered. And they might take a bit of extra time because they're waiting on some slow asynchronous query that's happening in the background. But then, yeah, they can eventually load and you just get those replacements. And I think that if you have really good loading spinners, or like loading kind of like, you know how you can have like fake content, it's not quite there, like images that aren't quite images, they look like blurred out images or something. It's not a great experience when we see these things for a really long time. Like a lot of, like, I don't know, if you load Facebook or something React heavy and slow, you'll end up seeing maybe loading, I don't know what they're even called, these loading placeholders for a really long time. But they do make a big difference, I think, if they're really quick. Like you immediately see them and then immediately they're replaced with the content. And we're just trying to make it so that you can get those extra few milliseconds of performance and perceived performance, I guess, more than anything. Yeah, and just see how far we can push it. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how fast Phlex is. If you are still IO bound, your page is still slow, because once you start rendering your view, you have to start rendering these database queries. That's not great. It's like still a bad experience. So as much as possible, if we can make those queries happen in the background and then actually do something with what we've got while we're waiting on them, I think that's going to be much better.
It sounds a lot better. And I do think that there is a lot to perceived performance. That's why if you go on sites like Expedia, when you are like moving between bits of the app that require a lot of loading, like you get a fancy animation and it's still pretty slow, but that fancy animation that's doing something, you're just, I don't know, it tricks your brain into, oh, look, there's this little plane traveling through the sky. That's exciting. And then all of a sudden your page is there and you don't even realize that that page just took like 2 whole seconds to load. And it's that perception. I was at a Liberty.js a few years ago, and there was a really good talk on perceived performance and using loaders to affect perceived performance. I don't know if that was a recorded conference or not. If it was, I will have to include that in the show notes. You're definitely right that perceived performance is big thing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the request is taking as long as the whole request is taking. But once you reach the end, if the perception was that it was faster, then perception is reality. Therefore, it was faster. One question I had about this was, as you're starting to load, you're sending these chunks. So maybe they see your nav bar come up first. If they click a link or a button or perform some action on the site as it's being streamed over, what happens then? Is it just as simple as, oh, okay, we close the stream then and we move over to this new redirect? Or
I think
does streaming affect that at all?
I think so. I have no idea, but I would guess that it doesn't stop the server from sending that stream of information, because, I mean, it might send a message to stop sending it, right? It might disconnect, but the server for a while is going to keep sending it, right? Because it doesn't know that you've disconnected. But I think what will happen in terms of like your experience is you'll just start loading the next page. And the browser will probably just throw away whatever gets sent from the server during the interim period, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
There are a few things that you can do, and this isn't unique to Phlex, that can improve performance just by doing stuff asynchronously. So usually what happens is you will go to the controller will then redirect to the view, and you start rendering parts of the view before you get to a place where a view requires a database query. And at that point, the database query is kicked off and it starts running, right? And everything has to wait on that database query until it's finished. Then the database query finishes, and then your view can come back in and, for example, iterate over each item, like each article or whatever, and output them into the view. So what you can do instead, and you can do this without Phlex, is you can use Active Records load async, and you basically just put load async on the end of your database query, and it will immediately start executing that query. It doesn't wait until the relation is used, until someone actually looks at it and tries to iterate over it. It just starts executing it immediately. And it doesn't block you until you try to look at it. So you can take this query that's running in the background, as long as you don't look at it, as long as you don't try to grab the first item or iterate over it or something like that, then you can continue doing other things. And it's still loading in the background. And what we do in Phlex is we just take advantage of the fact that we can check whether or not this thing has loaded. And if it has loaded, we can carry on as normal. If it hasn't loaded, we can say, well, here's an opportunity to make a chunk. We've got some stuff in the buffer. Maybe it's like a heading that says articles or something like that. And the user hasn't got it yet. And it would cost resources to send it to the user now, except we're not doing anything anyway. We're just waiting on this query, so we may as well. And that's where the advantage of this kind of comes in. And all you need to do in the view is say await articles.each. And that await thing will do the flush if it can, or if it makes sense for it to do that. That's kind of the interface.
That sounds awesome. As you're moving along, developing it, what is the testing procedure like? Because you said you've run into browsers, have had varying degrees of success with it, as far as sometimes there's no difference. How do you go about saying, okay, milestone 1 is it works in Chrome and then move on to the next browser, or milestone 1 is just the basic gist of it is there? How do you work and then test on something like this?
So we could test that the server is doing what it's meant to do, but really what I've been testing so far is the experience from the browser is what I want it to be, which is that it starts not just downloading, but actually rendering the view as it comes down. So the way that I've tested this so far is to make an artificially slow database query that has a sleep in it. And so I don't know, you make it sleep for a couple of seconds, and you make sure that when you load the page, everything else renders above it. And then a couple of seconds later, you then get the list of articles that renders. So that's kind of been the testing so far, is just to actually load it in a browser with artificially slow asynchronous background things. The other thing I didn't mention is it's not just active record queries, but you can also use concurrent promises from the concurrent Ruby library. So this is great if you've got something you need to make an external web request. For example, maybe you have a controller that goes out to some headless content management system, and it has to wait for that content management system to come back with the content before it can render it into your application. What you can do there is you can put in your controller the request, and you can put that request inside, say, a concurrent Ruby promise. And that promise starts executing in the background, but it doesn't block the rest of the view from rendering up until you need to look at it. And works exactly the same way. The interface is the same. We support Active Record, concurrent Ruby, and also Socketry async, the async gem. So those are the 3 main ways that I've seen people do this, and possibly will support other libraries and things in the future.
Very cool. Very cool. That is a whole boatload of cool stuff that you are working on. I guess from a blocker's perspective on all of that.
Right.
I'm sure you have blockers now, but I'm also a little interested in when you run into a blocker, because you're doing this open source and it's not a large team or a large organization where you have a lot of people to bounce ideas off of or things. Before we get formally into blockers, like when you do run into a blocker, how are you going about solving it, especially for something that's like, hey, we're working on streaming. That's not heavily used. So you can't even like look at other projects for inspiration because there's just not a lot of it out there. So how do you go about solving a blocker when you're working on a project like this?
Yeah, that's usually a lot easier than when working on streaming HTML, because if you go to Google and search how to stream HTML, you just get a ton of results that talk about how to stream video or like audio or that kind of thing, and barely anything on how to stream HTML, especially not how to stream HTML to the point that browsers start rendering it. And that's like the tricky bit. Usually when I run into blockers, and in fact, even on this, there are other people who work on Phlex with me sometimes. There are people on Discord. There are people who just come on GitHub and comment on issues or pull requests. I have a lot of people that I can go to. I also just post on Mastodon. I've run into this problem. Does anyone know how to solve this? Or if it's specifically related to Rails, there's great Rails discussion forums and things like that. So I can often get a lot of help, and people are very willing to help out with these things. I've had people offer to come jump on tuple and pair with me on tricky problems, and that's been great. I think when it comes to streaming, and this is kind of really getting into real blockers, the one thing that I haven't got past is Safari. Basically, just doesn't like rendering streams.
Yes, Safari, the new IE.
Yeah, it's not terrible. In fact, Safari, I am very impressed with Safari, especially their most recent release to Mac and iOS. I can't remember, 16.4 or something like that. Incredibly impressive. So many new features in CSS, HTML, even features like you can now send notifications to a web app on iPhone. So one of the main reasons why people felt that they needed to make iPhone apps instead of like web apps, like why you would need to use, say, something like Turbo Native, is because you could never send a notification or a badge or anything to, if you just have your web app and you add it to your home screen. But now they've just released a thing that lets you do that, which I think is pretty awesome. I think Safari's great. It's actually my main browser, which is why it's so frustrating for me that this doesn't work. But I can't get it to work where it renders out an HTML stream. I can't figure out what headers are needed. And what's so frustrating is I have this other project, which is really, really basic. And it's just, basically I've been experimenting with Falcon and Rack. And it's just Falcon and Rack. There are no headers. And I've been streaming some stuff and it renders in Safari on the fly. And I don't know why. And I don't know why I can't get Rails to do it. I don't know if it's something to do with the fact that with Falcon, it's over HTTPS and I haven't tested Rails on HTTPS, or if it's something to do with HTTP2, or if it's like some specific header that is not meant to be there or something. And I'm having a really hard time figuring out why Safari just won't do it. Like Safari basically just wants to wait until the whole thing is rendered. It's loaded and then it will render it, which is completely not what I want to do.
Right. Yeah. And by Safari is the new IE, I just mean that now that we don't have IE to grumble about, that is what I hear most people go, works everywhere but Safari. Like Safari is always a little slow to like, yeah, it's great. You can do push notifications through Safari now. Welcome to 5 years ago for a lot of other browsers. You know, like the Safari experience is actually pretty nice overall. It's just there's always, as a developer who's got to support multiple different browsers, it used to be IE was just like hey, we've got this hack because of IE. Right. And now it's sort of like, hey, we've got this one little hack because of Safari. They just do one little thing. And part of that, I think, is because IE became Edge, and Edge is really just Chrome under the hood, or Chromium, as it were. But yeah, no, that was a joke and not an actual dig at Safari. Please don't kill me, folks who actually really like Safari. I was making a funny.
Is that right? There's only really the three main browsers. We've got Firefox, Edge.
Yeah, well, you've got Firefox, Chrome, and Edge are running on Chromium. You've got Safari, but you do have things like, I think Opera is still a thing. The Arc browser, that's somewhat new. I just started playing with that. It is I think it requires a little bit of a mental shift to use it because it's not your standard browser experience. But that one, I have absolutely no idea what they're using under the hood. So I don't know if it's just a reskinning of Chromium or if it's its own thing, and then how anything will work for it.
Yeah, I'm sure it's Chromium. I've tried the Arc browser and it's not for me. Thing is, though, I'm not the kind of person that has a lot of tabs open at a time. And I know that there are loads of people out there who do that. And I think it would be excellent for those people. But I have maybe like 3 or 4 tabs open at a time. And so I just like them to be across the top. That works for me.
Yeah, I think I idle at about 10 tabs. I have a new personal rule that if I hit 30 tabs, I just flush the browser and I restart from wherever I was. Because like, there's no way I remember what was going on in 30 freaking tabs. But I have definitely hit the point where I'm like, okay, I can't even click into this next tab because it's just bombarded. I have so many tabs open. You can't click them because you're just actually hovering over the X at this point. It's out of control, which is why I think I want to try to use the Arc browser because it would probably be great for someone like me.
Yeah. I also don't usually click on tabs to navigate. I use like Command Shift and then square brackets or whatever they are.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I would love to get better with the keyboard commands for whatever browser I'm in or whatever app I'm in, because I've gotten to the point where I'm actually pretty good with like the keyboard navigation in VS Code. I mean, I'm nowhere near like a professional Vim user of keyboard navigation, but I can do pretty well with it. And then I move to something else and I'm like, crap, that's right. That keyboard shortcut doesn't work here. How do I do that? Forget, I'm just going to click with my mouse. Yeah. So it would probably be worth it to invest some time into learning my keyboard shortcuts.
I recently had that exact experience moving to Zed. I'm using Zed as my main editor now, moving from Nova. And some of the keyboard shortcuts are different. It's really frustrating. But the one thing I do love about Zed is there are more keyboard shortcuts. So it's the only editor that I've had, for example, that lets you do... So in Zed, you can do Alt Up and it will select like... I don't know what the technical term is, but it like expands your selection out in both directions. So if you were in the middle of a method call, it will expand it like once to the entire method call. And then again, maybe to like the entire, I don't know, if condition, like if branch or something. And then again, it will go to the entire method and it kind of like just expands its way out. I don't know what that feature is called, but I use it all the time now. And that is cool. That Vim users have been using forever. And I'm just learning it first time. I can't handle an entirely keyboard editor, so it's great for me.
Yeah, I really liked Zed. My first experience with it, just downloaded it to tinker. Like I abuse extensions in VS Code entirely too much to just switch right over to Zed. But I will say, like, I have had a fair amount of problems getting SolarGraph to play nice in VS Code. Like when it's working, it's great. When it's not working, it's annoying. I opened Zed and I had it already configured for VS Code, but it had started misbehaving again. I opened Zed and it was this beautiful jump to definition, worked on everything, including like I hovered over, I think, Action View Base, and it opened a tab for the gem, like a bundle open, basically, but in the editor for the constant I was on. It just knew exactly where to go, which version of Rails I was running, everything. I was like, if I could get that in VS Code, I'd be set. Or if they can just open it up to extensions, I will move, because that was just that experience of being able to go and say, oh, hey, what's actually going on here? And not having to do a bundle open because we use Docker and things get weird. Or just go into GitHub and start poking around, just having it there. Or just go to definition on this one thing. It was awesome. And I really liked that the very first thing, and I know you didn't get this benefit, but like for me, they opened up and it was like, hey, what kind of keyboard commands do you want to map to? Like, are you coming from VS Code? Are you coming from Atom? They had a couple of different ones there. I was like, oh, that's awesome. Because when I went to VS Code, I was coming from Atom, and this was a few years ago, but there was an extension and that was great. Like I could just install the extension to get the Atom key maps on, and I didn't have to like relearn every keyboard shortcut. But I had to start the browser up and then go to the extension and install this extension. And Zed was like, nope, out of the box, you get to choose what kind of key map you use. And I thought that was really cool. I thought that was a really nice, yes, we get you kind of touch.
I don't know if they're ever going to do extensions for Zed. I guess they probably will at some point. But it seems at the moment that they're just building in the best features like straight into the editor. And that seems to be working pretty well. Like they're adding Copilot support soon. They've got Server graph support built in, which is pretty unheard of. The only other editor that does that is RubyMine. Otherwise, it's like completely unheard of. I'm really excited about Shopify's project. What is it? Ruby LSP?
Yeah.
That is very exciting, especially as, well, to start with, it's built on syntax tree. So it's going to be amazingly great understanding Ruby syntax. And then secondly, they are working on providing a kind of plugin system to the language server. So that means that you could have, I don't know, like a plugin for Rails that is able to tell you hover over a has many relationship and it can give you information about that relationship or like about the other model or something. Stuff like that, I think, is going to be incredible. And I'm excited to be able to build a plugin for Phlex. Phlex, it kind of stops you from being able to do things like install a Tailwind extension that allows you to autocomplete Tailwind classes, that kind of thing, because it's all Ruby and no one expects you to be writing HTML in Ruby. So I think that being able to have some kind of like plugin system where I can write some helpers, like an extensions work based on the Ruby syntax tree, but are able to understand that actually in this context, if you've subclassed from a Phlex HTML constant, then you are clearly trying to write HTML. So if you have an H1 tag, an H1 method call, that is an H1 tag. Or like if you type, I don't know, A space H, right, it's going to recommend href because an A tag has an href attribute. So that kind of thing to me is really exciting, being able to do that. And I also, I don't know, I have a lot of hopes for that project. And I think it'll be incredible if they also build in support for RBS signatures. So you can have type signatures written in RBS files, and maybe it can like understand these are the methods that you can call, and these are the arguments that they can receive, and these are the types of those arguments and things like that, all within this language server. I think that would be awesome. Yeah. Even if they don't do it, I wonder if some kind of like plugin system would be able to do it with RBS.
Yeah, because I think it's separate extension, but it plays pretty nice with their sorbet. I guess it's a sorbet LSP, or at least some sort of plugin or extension that will figure out types for you based on your sorbet documentation. But yeah, I'm sure that that's something, if nothing else, someone somewhere will make a plugin for it. Because I agree with you. Like the fact that they're creating a plugin system as like part of the main roadmap project for this is awesome. And
I really hope on that point that the community can get behind RBS instead of sorbet, because it's like an actual official typing system for Ruby and it could be really great. The language is already so much easier to work with than sorbet to me. And I think that if we had better tooling around it, Steep is pretty good. I started working on adding Steep to Phlex recently. And I added tons and tons of type signatures and eventually got stuck on the fact that Steep can't understand passing a splat of arguments to super. So it's like that kind of thing just like killed the project. I can't do it. I can't use Steep in my thing. And Steep, by the way, is a static type checker for Ruby using the RBS signatures. Basically, you can write method signatures or like signatures for your constants, your methods, everything, instance variables in these separate RBS files. And then Steep is able to understand the RBS files and your Ruby code and detect whether or not you've got any type errors, essentially. And it's excellent. I also think that having these separate files, although some people might not like having separate files, I can kind of understand why they've done it. To start with, you could technically build something that would extract RBS signatures from comments. So that's a possibility. But I actually really like the idea of having my type signatures and my documentation in separate files to my code, because we like to put documentation like yard docs in our code. And it makes sense because you want to have your documentation close to the code so it doesn't get out of sync. The code changes, you want the documentation to change. And that makes so much sense. It's what we do in Phlex as well. But it's also very messy. You look at your code and there's just like loads and loads of comments. Sometimes you just want to scroll down to the next method. You have to scroll through an entire page of comments and they're just documentation. So I find that to be quite challenging, like how many comments are in the actual source code. I think it would be amazing if we could write our documentation with our signatures, not with the source code, but with the type signatures in separate files, because then we could have all that documentation directly linked to the code. if your code changes in a way that's relevant to the documentation, it's going to change your signature. If the signature changes, that's where you've got your docs. I think that would be amazing. Like having files that are like documentation and signatures, and then separate files that just like, here's your actual implementation of that documentation and those signatures. I think that would just be incredible. Like some kind of either update to Yard or new take on building Ruby documentation from RBS comments would just be amazing.
No, that does sound pretty awesome. And I did have the pleasure of talking to Ufuk at RubyConf Mini a little bit about their thoughts and plans. And he has some pretty interesting ideas. Like if anybody listening ever has the opportunity to just sit down and pick Ufuk's brain, like I highly recommend it because he has a lot of really cool and interesting ideas. And I'm very happy that he is involved so heavily with the Ruby and the Rails community because of these ideas that he has. And
yeah, that entire team, the Ruby and Rails infrastructure team at Shopify, they're just doing incredible stuff. There's YARP, which is amazing.
YARP is like, I don't know what you would qualify as done, but Kevin just posted, a few days ago, that he has it 100% spec coverage on it. And that is so exciting.
Yeah.
Like that is such a cool project. And he is another one that has this vision for what the parser needs to do, not just because of his experience with syntax tree, but just like the tooling that he has in his mind to give access to the community is like, yes, I want to live in the world that he envisions. Like
and he's
so exciting.
I can't believe how quickly YARP has come to reach 100% test cover, like passing tests, which is amazing. I'm guessing there's still a load of work to do in terms of like actually integrating that with the various interpreters, etc. And also they're working on integrating it with syntax tree, which is awesome. And I guess maybe like performance tweaks and stuff like that. But it's incredible that it's already able to like actually pass all the tests and understand Ruby syntax 100%. Because Ruby syntax is so weird. It has really enjoyed following Kevin's posts about like weird Ruby syntax that he runs into, which is amazing. You know, when Kevin runs into syntax he's not seen before, it's going to be weird.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He's posted some good ones that I admittedly have stolen for my game show of weird Ruby. And he had the opportunity to pair with him a couple of times. And he's always like, hey, you want to see something cool? And he'll show me some goofy ass Ruby. I'm like, no way. It's like, no, this passes the parser. Like Ruby can understand this. And it's a blessing and a curse of Ruby that you can do some wild things with syntax, but also like, hey, you can do some wild things with syntax. All right. So on to my favorite question. What is something cool or interesting or new that you want to share? It doesn't have to be coding related. It can be, but we've had everything from endangered hobbies and cloud scrubbing all the way into like, hey, Hotwire is pretty cool. And here's a new library from so-and-so. So what do you got? What is something that has gotten you pretty excited recently?
I've got two things and they're somewhat related. So the first thing is you should check out Aaron Francis' course on MySQL because it's excellent. It's so great. It's like a 7-hour, I think, something like that video course on MySQL for developers. And it's designed specifically for developers. So it doesn't get into the things that aren't particularly relevant for people like you and me who are building applications, but it does cover everything that you would want to know. So if you've ever thought, like I have a number of times, I should really get a bunch of books on MySQL and understand how the database works more deeply. But also, I don't want to understand everything about how a database works. Like a ton of this stuff is going to be irrelevant to me. I'm probably going to be looking for something like 30% of what these books have to cover. So this course basically just covers that, like specifically for developers. And it just goes over schema, and then it covers building indexes, queries, and then has a bunch of examples as well. And it's just fantastic. I've done the schema section so far, and I'm working through the indexes section. But yeah, highly recommend checking that out.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Aaron is a great teacher, and I know he has put a ton of time and effort into this course. I will +1 your recommendation of that course for anyone who's interested in getting better with MySQL. Or, I mean, really SQL in general, but yeah, MySQL specifically?
I think a bunch of the principles from this would be applicable to other databases, if not like the specific implementations. Some of the specific types that MySQL has, other databases might not have, but they'll probably have something similar. And all of the concepts and like principles that he discusses, pretty much applicable across the board, I think.
Agreed.
So the next thing, and this course, by the way, is completely free.
Yeah.
He could have charged
which is wild.
hundreds of dollars for this course because it's incredibly valuable. And I'd have paid hundreds of dollars for this course, but it's free. So definitely go and check that out.
You have no excuse, folks. Go take the course.
So somewhat related to that, the thing that I want to plug is SQLite. And this is a database that you probably used, probably because it's the default database installed with Rails. And you've probably used it only in kind of dev environments, maybe locally. But SQLite is really, really cool. Basically, you have a full database, all the powerful things that you can do with pretty much any other database. You can pretty much do them in SQLite as well. And it's actually pretty scalable, at least in terms of reads. Reading, especially if you have read replicas, incredibly scalable for that. Writing to SQLite is a slightly different story. There's a certain scale where writing to a single SQLite database would have issues, but you ultimately run into those issues with any kind of database. And I think what's really interesting about SQLite is it's so lightweight. Everything is stored in a single file. It's super easy to just spin up another database, right? It's just another file. So you could, in theory, and I don't think there's any practical ways to do this in Rails at the moment, but I think that it's happening and there are going to be ways to do this kind of thing soon. You could, in theory, have a single database per tenant of your web app. And the routing could basically route you to an application server that has a copy of that tenant's like SQLite database locally. And you could do everything like scoped to a single tenant in their database. And I think that concept is just incredible. So some other things around it are recently I've been reading about Lightstream, which is basically a way to make sure that your SQLite database can be replicated. So it allows you to basically back it up to AWS or like Azure Blob or storage or Google Cloud or something like that. So that's super interesting because obviously if you don't want to just have your database be on a single server and like not backed up anywhere. So being able to do that on the fly, streaming stuff that's going into your SQLite database directly to blob storage, I think is really cool. And Fly have been doing some work around this with a system called LightFS, which I think is also very interesting and one to keep an eye on.
You definitely have some good ones.
Yeah. So related to this, there is also a gem called SQLite, which is a different gem for connecting to SQLite. So there's the SQLite 3 gem that you probably use with Rails. SQLite is a bit different and apparently it's a lot faster. I haven't done a ton of testing with it, but in theory, it's tons faster for a bunch of things. So definitely check that out. It's definitely something that caught my eye and that I'm experimenting with. I think it would be so cool if we could build applications that didn't need all the complexities of all this peripheral infrastructure where you like deploy a web app, you need an application server, but you also need Redis and you also need MySQL or Postgres on a separate server and all of this infrastructure, like connecting them together. And then when you're doing sharding, that gets really complicated. I think it'd be awesome if we could do like really minimal SQLite-based web applications that run on a single server and back up on the fly to something like AWS S3. And where sharding is super lightweight, like you can shard one database per tenant if you want to. And where, like you don't need to use Redis because SQLite is so fast. And even if you're doing N+1 queries, it's all in memory. So if your database is small, you might not even notice it and it might not even be any faster to add an index. It's such an interesting project. And I think it's an old one, but it's like one that maybe we should, reconsider whether maybe this is something that we could actually use in production sometime. Like definitely not now, but I think over the next few years with Lightstream and things like that, this is definitely something that could happen. I think that'd be awesome.
No, that is definitely an interesting idea and thought. And I do the concept of every tenant almost having their own database because there isn't that heavy infrastructure complexity around the database.
Right.
Is very interesting. And it's funny that you bring up SQLite because honestly, way back in high school, before I really truly understood development and how things on the web were stored, SQLite is essentially how I thought applications stored stuff. Like I legitimately thought, oh yeah, every time you save anything on the web, it just opens a file and it writes to it. And when you have to like read it out, it's just reading the file. Like it wasn't until college that I was like, oh, right, databases, that's a thing. Duh. Yeah, but now it's like, actually, no, that wasn't a duh. Like someone else had that idea and it wasn't a bad one because here's SQLite.
Right. SQLite, the advantage is it's just using a single file. So it doesn't worry about things like user management or anything like that. Basically, the idea is if you have access to this file, you have access to the database. It's also incredibly well tested. There are like millions of tests. It's got 100% branch coverage. And then they have this whole rigorous testing process before every release that just runs like, I think millions, if not billions of tests. Every possible permutation of every possible query is kind of tested. I think it's such an interesting project. It's quite an old project, I think, but also it's something that has been popular for local native apps, that kind of thing, embedded systems, because it's so lightweight. But I think that it would be so cool to see this running in more like traditional web apps, multi-tenant web apps. And I think it's going to be possible in the next few years.
I agree. I think that is not out of the realm of possibility. I think really at this point, with the way that the web behaves, all it really takes is someone to make it happen, even almost like a prototype stage where it's like, yeah, we're not at the level of Facebook, so we can get away with doing this. And then they just build tooling around it. And I think that's what ends up getting picked up is when you have a project, it's a solid idea, the tooling is decent, and like it's fairly easy to get up and running. Then when you start hitting the rough edges, that's when people are like, well, I've already done all this work to get here. I'll just fix this rough edge. And before you know it, you have an entire community behind an idea, and then it takes off. So speaking of community, just a quick note to anybody listening and who's thinking about how do I improve as a developer? How do I continue? I think you hit the nail on the head. And I've been trying to drive this home with my team at work of like, hey, how do you get unblocked with things? How do you move past something that's blocking you, especially like you're not really working for a company. Mm-hmm. You don't really have like someone sitting at the desk next to you or someone that's on your team. That's the whole point is to, and you brought up, well, I have people that still work on this open source project. I have a Discord server. I have all these forums. You have a community. Mm-hmm. And I think that is such an underrated debugging tool that you can go to Mastodon or Twitter or Discord or whatever you use, wherever you find your community, and you can just say, hey, I'm stuck on this. We, as programmers, engineers, whatever you want to call us, we love problem solving. So if you just put a problem out into ether, someone's going to go, ooh, I like this. This is an interesting problem. Let's solve it.
And I think times I've done that. I've like seen a problem and be like, I just can't put that down. That's too interesting. I want to know why this isn't working for them.
Right. Yeah. And I've really been trying to drive that home with folks at my own job where they're like, man, how did you solve that so fast? I'm like, I didn't solve it. I posted in the Go Rails Discord that I was having a problem with X, and like 4 people responded before I even could answer the first person with possible solutions or at least places to look like. And I got a ton of knowledge from it. Build a community. However you need to do it, build a community and you will have the answer to all of your problems in some way, shape, or form on some timeline. And speaking of community, and this is where this is leading, are you going to RailsConf? Because I believe this episode will come out before RailsConf happens.
No, unfortunately not.
No, I'm not going to be a bummer. Do you have any stateside conferences coming up that you think you're going to come to? No. Okay.
Year. Nothing booked in. I'm going to try and do that next year stateside. Okay. But this year, the only thing I have booked at the moment is Brighton Ruby, which is also coming up, which I'm very excited about.
Yes, that's a good one. That is on my list of things to eventually get out to. That Yoroku and RubyKagi are all on my...
Go to RubyKagi too.
I might be able to make it happen this upcoming spring, depending on when exactly the dates are, because my daughter has been begging to go to Japan for like 2 years. And I'm like, I could kill 2 birds with one stone. I could be like, hey, we're going to Japan. Also, I need 3 days to myself. I might be able to sneak that one in there.
Definitely.
Well, is there anything else that you wanted to add, talk about, touch on before we start wrapping up?
No, I would just mention on the community thing you mentioned, in particular, the stimulus reflex community on Discord I've found to be particularly helpful. There are a bunch of great Discords out there, but that one for me is excellent. And yeah, they've been really great there.
Yep, that's another good one. I agree. There are so many. Sometimes it can feel slightly overwhelming, but you'll find the ones that fit your flavor of how you consume information and folks out there. You just got to find at least one. Everyone needs at least one, I think. Awesome. So this was a ton of fun to have you on. Where can folks find you on the internet?
Right. You can find me on Mastodon. I am Joel Drapper at ruby.social on Mastodon. You could also subscribe to my podcast, Rooftop Ruby, that I've started a few weeks ago with Colin Donnell. We've done, I think it's 6 episodes so far, and we're probably going to keep doing them because they're a lot of fun. So
yeah, it's a good podcast too. I've listened to, I think I'm 3 episodes in so far. It's a good one. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, we kind of don't really know exactly what we're doing, but we've done a couple of interviews so far. Generally, we just like talk about things. And I think maybe we'll eventually figure out exactly what our niche is. But right now, it's just like talking about Ruby, talking about technology, pretty informal. Yeah, check it out and see if it's to your taste.
Yeah, definitely check it out. I will have it in the show notes along with the links to your Mastodon and to Phlex. And I will throw in there, even though we didn't actually get a chance to talk about it, Marco's project Flexing.
Yeah.
Right? The one that ERB to Flex converter.
Right.
He wrote that is cool.
Yeah, it's pretty solid ERB to Flex converter that will take, and not just HTML, but also all of the Ruby bits of your ERB, including calls to Rails helpers. And it will actually make those work in Flex pretty reliably. So yeah, that is an awesome project.
It is a cool one that I cannot speak highly enough of, as with pretty much anything Marco does. It's just, he is a fountain of cool projects and interesting ideas and quality work. So shout out to him. All right. Well, this was a blast. I'm glad I finally got you on, but we'll definitely have you on again because it's as Flex continues to move forward, I will want an excuse to pick your brain on it.
Awesome. This has been really fun. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Well, everyone, I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.